I would like to officially welcome Dr. Joseph Kerski. Thank him very much. Thank you very much, Joseph, for agreeing to do this talking about ethics, spatial thinking, geotechnologies. We were having a nice chat before everyone joined in and we got started here. And we're going to continue that, but we're going to focus on ethics and spatial thinking. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Joseph. It's all yours. And thank you again, once again.
Oh, many, many thanks. Greetings, folks, from a few states southeast of you, Colorado. But we won't let those state borders come between us. I love your part of the world, and Keith and I were just talking about the fact that we were both at the Intermountain Eurissa GIS conference up in Post Falls back in May. Beautiful part of the world, and I've been to numerous campuses in your state. Keep in touch. There's something I can do to be of assistance for you. I'm on the ESRI education team. It's a team that has existed since 1992, and it is completely dedicated to helping schools, libraries, museums, community colleges, technical colleges, tribal colleges, universities, after school programs be successful with geotechnology and spatial thinking. So that is our sole goal. And we're very well supported by Jack Dangerman. Some of you have probably heard Jack talk about education. He is very passionate, as are we all, about helping students become positive change agents through spatial thinking and the application of geotechnology. So very happy to be a part of your community, not just today, but going forward. Okay. Keith can put my contact information, and I'm happy to link in with you, whatever it takes for us to keep the conversation moving forward. Because these are so important issues that we're grappling with here in our world. And I would argue, and you could probably relate in your own work, that maps have always been very powerful shapers of people's opinions and attitudes. And now, with everyone being a map producer through ArcGIS Online and other capabilities, it is even more important now than ever that we think thoughtfully about how we're sharing, what we're sharing, how we're mapping, what choices we're making when we choose our projections and our symbology and our classification method. Because as you folks are aware, the audience for our output nowadays as GIS professionals is vastly more than it was even 5 years ago, right? So we have a very powerful set of data and tools at our fingertips, and let's use them wisely. So with that, I love this picture right here. I was at Kansas State University. There's a data door. I said, I've got to use that picture. That is intriguing. What's behind the data door? So let's chat about, and this whole thing is in the chat box so that you can interact with it in the future. Thanks, Brian. Exactly. Because I put more things in here than we're actually going to have time to unravel today, okay, and grapple with. But I hope it's a good, useful resource for you instructors, for the people working in government, nonprofit, private industry, where you're sharing this with your colleagues, your coworkers, etc. Let's start with a couple of definitions. These are somewhat nebulous terms in some ways, but I think it's important to, come to some sort of, okay, I understand where Joseph's coming from, and maybe my own definition is slightly different, and that's okay. We can have a discussion about it. But first of all, I believe that teaching equity and ethics are important in a wide variety of settings, even if it's just coworkers or in a university or a school. It's not something that we should do like we did in the past. Hey, students, in week 13 of our course, we're going to talk about ethics. It shouldn't be boxed into a week where we talk about ethics. It should be sprinkled in, and I'm going to offer some practical advice to sprinkle this in to any workshop, short course, workshop, or full semester course that you or your colleagues happen to be teaching. Given the key social and technological forces, they are going to be ever more important in the future. And I believe that these topics can actually be powerfully and engagingly done using GIS and the geographic approach. So here are some definitions. You can read these just as well as I can, but equity, impartiality, fairness, and justice for all people as implemented in social policy. Social equity, you can see the sort of the nuanced definition there, building on social on equity in terms of social equity. And then the connection to education is really the most important part, I think, right here of this particular definitional discussion. And that to me is that these issues strike close to home as to what you and I care about. You and I were drawn to GIS because we wanted to make a difference in people's lives, and we actually care about people and we care about the planet. And we want to protect and sustain and make the planet more resilient, right? And sustainable. So these concepts, I think, strike close to home in terms of our profession, but also strike close to home as it was what makes us human and what drew many of us into the profession in the first place. We want to make a positive difference in people's lives. And we also believe that all people, students and others, can thrive and that each person has a unique and valued contribution to make. And I'll talk more about what unique contributions are you making to your own workplace. And that's, to me, part of this discussion. We seek to empower all people to be change agents, positive change agents. GIS is an overwhelmingly positive force in our world. All technologies that humans have created have been used for good and also for harm. No exception with GIS. I get this from time to time. Joseph, don't you know that drone strikes are being used? So geotechnology is being used to wage war on people. Certainly. Think of photography, a wonderful invention. It's also being used for child exploitation, et cetera. So there are nasty things about any technology that people use it for harm. But 99 point X% of all the use of geotechnologies is the Nature Conservancy, the Idaho DNR, the Jane Goodall Elephant Foundation, et cetera, right? It is overwhelmingly a force for good. So I truly believe that you folks are a positive force in our world. So I want to encourage you, don't give up. Okay. Keep knocking on all the doors and windows, promoting why this matters in your own workplace and why more people need to be thinking spatially, holistically, and critically. Also, though, GIS, that said, is a disruptive technology. It breaks down barriers, and sometimes people using GIS ruffle the feathers and ruffle the foundations of a organization for good reason, right? You're working with a variety of people and you're helping people work together. And sometimes that doesn't fit well with the way organizations are structured. But I would submit that that's a good thing also, because we need organizations to be creative and innovative and maybe not just sort of rest on past laurels, but rather, hey, we've got some serious problems in our world that we need to grapple with and solve. Water, energy, migration, climate, I mean, you name it, pine beetle infestation, and so on, invasive species, natural hazards. I mean, the list goes on. All the UN SDGs, right, folks, the Sustainable Development Goals, education, health, and more are spatial in nature and hence can be grappled with and solved through the application of geotechnologies. So, what unique strengths do you bring to your own teaching, research, and your own day-to-day work in the organizations that you represent here today and those of you watching this in the future? I'm going to submit a few that I am probably not alone in, but unique things that you should not ignore, that you should bring to the workplace and celebrate. And part of ethics and ethical thinking, I think, is to evaluate the credentials and background of the speaker. So just to let you know where I'm coming from, not to bore you to tears, but for those of you watching this and listening later on, I'm going to share this in three reasons. One, so you know that I didn't just decide to talk about ethics yesterday. Okay. I've been actually immersed in GIS and society issues, research, et cetera, for quite a few years. The second reason why I wanted to share this is to encourage you that you're not stuck in the same organization your entire career. In my case, I've been very blessed to be in nonprofit, government, academia, and private industry with education at Esri in my career. And the third reason why I wanted to share this as a note of encouragement is that geospatial technology and spatial thinking are going to be valuable to you no matter where you go in your career path, especially for those of you that are maybe mid-career starting in with GIS or people watching this that are thinking about making GIS a significant part of your day-to-day lives. I hope those are encouraging words. And again, thinking about what unique aspects of past and present that you're bringing to your workplace. I made maps as a kid. Maybe some of you can identify. I made maps on big poster board of made up places. I labeled all my streets. I had docks, ports, university campuses. I even had address ranges in the margins of my maps. What kid cares about address ranges? The point is, you've got geeky things that you did in the past and you do at present, and maybe none of the other people in your circle of friends or acquaintances or colleagues likes to do those things. That's okay. That's okay. We have a lot in common, but we also have unique things that have brought us to this moment. It could have been a book that you read as a kid, a teacher, mentor, family member that had great influence on you, a field trip that you took. You were the family navigator and you balanced maps on your lap as you navigated through. There you go. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, we all have the things that nudged us into this. And to me, exploring the landscapes of Western Colorado, where I grew up, buttes, mesas, Manco Shale, and also making maps were two things in my own pathway. Now, why should you care about that GIS is being taught? Well, touching on what we talked about earlier, maps are increasingly used as means of communication. Now, maps have been used for thousands of years, right? As powerful, lots of information in a short amount of space, whether it was the Babylonian clay tablets or Al-Idrisi's map on two big plates of silver from the 1100s. Now, that would have been a difficult map to fold. Get it? Because it was on two big plates of silver. Wood blocks, wood carvings, and then in the dawn of the 20th century, right, on copper plates that were replicated into many paper maps from U.S. Geological Survey and other organizations. And then toward the end of the 20th century and then into our own in the digital form. So maps are increasingly used as effective means of communication and in a widening array of disciplines and topics. And I think that feeds directly into our discussion here about ethics. How do we thoughtfully think about and teach about these concepts? So, why does it matter? Okay. Well, I touched on this earlier. Everyone is now a map producer. There's no Esri bouncer in ArcGIS Online saying, you can't put that map there. All you need is a little bit of metadata and an account, right? And that's just one of many platforms that you can share things on these days, correct? But the point is, it's an open platform. And that's very powerful, but you've got a whole mishmash of authoritative data and unauthoritative data, or data that looks good and there's no metadata about the producer, where they came from, the scale the map was created at, how often it's updated, their sources, and all that sort of thing, right? So it's an open platform. It's kind of the Wild West in some ways. Now, there's also the Living Atlas of the World, which is a subset of ArcGIS Online that probably many of you are aware of. And it has about 9,000 layers and maps and apps in it. But even the authoritative content that it represents is not perfect, right? Maps are very useful representations of reality. We have an oblate spheroid that we're on, right, folks? It is a representation only. Even though we've got digital twins and these very high resolution 3D tools at our fingertips that we can very accurately and precisely and realistically represent real landscapes and real phenomenon, we still are representing the world in these digital tools. So develop a healthy, critical view of maps and mapped data is my main mantra, couched in this ethics framework. You have great capability, but you also have a great responsibility, right, folks? Absolutely. Now, there is growing concern for geotechnology's role in privacy, location privacy, surveillance, and global conflicts. Okay, that's part of the scenario here. And also concern about the replicability and reproducibility crisis. What do I mean by that? There are articles saying, hey, this whole academic publishing that has been going on for centuries, but especially in the last couple of decades, that's good. Nothing wrong with that. But increasingly, knowing the results of someone's research is not enough. Why can't we demand an increasing number of people? Why can't authors, researchers publish the data along with the article so that I don't have to start over with my invasive species in the forest study? I can use someone else's data and build from there without going through lots and lots of processes. Now, sure, there's academic integrity, there's copyright issues, and there's lots of issues to uncover, but I think those arguments are valid. Why can't we have more data published along with the articles? And GIS can help us get there with these open data platforms, libraries, hub sites, etc. But there's also awareness of pitfalls in making inferences from geodata. For example, this ecological fallacy that many of you are aware of from your, academic background, for example, not necessarily the ecology in terms of ecoregions and biomes, but ecological in the sense of dealing with aggregates. So, for example, a correlation at the aggregate does not imply correlation at the individual level. Example, suppose COVID infection, we were just chatting about that, Johns Hopkins University dashboard before the recording started, but is correlated with percent Asian at the census tract level. This does not imply that individual Asian descendants are more susceptible to COVID infection, but implies only that areas with high proportions of Asians also have high rates of infection. So the whole correlation does not imply causation argument, those are the kinds of things that you folks in the GIS community understand and can provide real leadership, I would argue, to the increasing number of people that I'm going to use some pieces of geotechnology. I really don't have a background in this. But for example, I was talking earlier about my mission on my team, spreading GIS around in academia to sociology, business, data science, history, other disciplines. They don't have time, and they never will, to learn all the things that you folks know about the modifiable aerial unit problem and map projections and all that sort of thing. So this is where you could provide leadership. Hey, you're looking at shipping routes across the Arctic, and you're in the School of Business. There's something called a map projection. There's something called a polar map projection. You probably should think about those, and here's how to use those. Don't just use the default map projection. Why? Because you want your measurements to be accurate and your analysis to be more precise. Okay, another thing is that maps have long had this aura of authenticity, right, folks? Oh my gosh, they tend to be believed. Now, Keith, I, and others probably have, and others, we all have our set of bad maps that we show students on a regular basis. Maps that are not necessarily intentionally misleading, although we offer those as well, but also maps that are unintentionally misleading. The colors are a rainbow color for the percent of pine beetle infestation. Is blue more than red? Is green more than purple? That kind of stuff. Or an inappropriate classification method, or an inappropriate projection, or something else that makes it misleading. So take that responsibility seriously. Do not unintentionally or intentionally mislead your audience. Maps, again, are representations of reality, as I talked about earlier, but it's not just me and people recently. The map is not the territory, said Korzybski back in 1933, so almost 100 years ago. This was already in the discussion. Okay. Another thing to think about is that the dominant theme of the user experience in GIS has been sort of the user is free to choose which functions to employ on which data and is left to interpret the results. Michael Goodchild and I had this conversation not too long ago. Michael Goodchild, one of the founding members of GI Science as a movement back at UCSB 1991. And today, ArcGIS Pro is just one tool of many, right? But it has alone thousands of functions, as many of you know. But the UX philosophy remains the same. The ethical behavior is largely the responsibility of the user. So I just lay this out to my own development teams here at Esri, but also you as the community of developers and practitioners. What tools do we need to build to help users make more ethical decisions? Can we do something in the software tools? Should there be warnings, pop-ups, stored workflows, something else? There's a lot that's been written on uncertainty. How do we represent uncertainty in mapping? Is it a fuzzy boundary? Is it a wiggled line, sine wave line for those tornadoes that are represented as straight lines instead of we don't actually know where those tornadoes were, and so on. So it's just something to think about. Why engage with these ethical discussions? Again, there's the rising awareness that maps are powerful shapers of human behavior, decisions, etc. Thanks, Keith. Much appreciated. And it's not just us talking about this in 2024. I read this book actually as a grad student way back in the 1990s, which I realize is before many of you were born. The point is that John Pickles at UNC Chapel Hill wrote this, what I consider to be the sort of the first book on social implications of GIS, back when GIS was rather clunky, admittedly. But these discussions actually go back. Many of you are also aware of Mark Monmonier's How to Lie with Maps. That's kind of required, How to Lie with Maps, required reading for many students these days, and for good reason. It's very compelling and approachable, even for family members, to say, "Hey, why are you concerned about mapping? Aren't maps all truth?" Oh, Okay. And there's this rising concern about artificial intelligence. I just taught a workshop in AI. We have about 100 tools, for example, in the ArcGIS ecosystem, extracting features from imagery. Survey 123, giving a prompt. Hey, give me a tree survey. Done. 15 questions. Do you like some of those questions? Do you want to toss some of those questions? Do you want to keep some of those questions? But generative AI enabled Survey 123. Why is that important? Because every tree survey, for example, just taking one example, has common elements. Why should you have to create every single one of those tree surveys from scratch around the world? Couldn't you have a tool that generates, okay, here's a Likert scale for the tree condition, here's the species question, here is the symbology, etc. Yes. Also, Business Analyst Web has a what I think is going to work its way into other GIS tools where you don't actually have to know the location of all the tools in the graphical user interface. And that has, of course, great implications for what Keith and I and other instructors teach. So, for example, in Business Analyst Web right now, you can enable a AI assistant, and you can say, I want a median age map by county in Idaho. Okay, using Business Analyst Web, done. I want to modify the symbology. I don't know where the symbology is in Business Analyst Web. It directs you to the part of the graphical user interface and highlights it and then offers tips. Do you need help on how to use the symbology, etc.? I want an infographic on the median age in Idaho with median age, median income, and a couple of other things included. Done. Interesting. So there are AI tools, but there's also concern about if we have models that use AI in GIS, do we understand the model? Do we understand what is behind the model? When you and I for years have been using things like Model Builder and we built those tools, we knew what those tools do and did, and we built these models and we run these models and we tweak them for various purposes. With some of these AI tools, is there metadata? And do we understand the metadata if there is metadata? Interesting. I'm not advocating to be overly cautious and not use these tools, but I still don't want people to go click, 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 done. And I really didn't understand what this particular feature extraction model for imagery and created all these buildings. What did it use for criteria? And there are new initiatives. I'm going to talk and point you to some resources here today in the next 3 hours. Just kidding. We don't have 3 hours. Just wanted to make sure you folks are on your toes. But Code of Ethics, Mapmaker's Mantra, the American Geographical Society's Ethical Geo Column. There's other resources out there for you to tap into. So ethics, I believe, is too important to be relegated in an academic setting to the end or week 14 of a course. It should be integrated not just in GIS and geography and environmental science courses, but I would submit into any course where the where matters and where communication matters, which is probably every course under the sun. Data science, civil engineering, computer science, and so on. Where can I teach this? Again, I would submit that it really should be taught in every single course. And that's a nice way that our community, once again, can show some leadership that, hey, there are these geotechnology tools that help students understand this in practical ways. What kind of practical ways? Okay, let's start with how many apps on your phone are tracking your location right now? And I've worked with down to grade 6 on this question. I don't know. Why does that matter? Well, if I need my pizza delivered, I need to give my address. Okay, sure. There's lots of reasons to give your own address out. There are other reasons not to share. There's other reasons not to share data. So, for example, I have this thing. I know it sounds super boring. Oh my gosh, Joseph, I can't stand the excitement. But my spatial reserves data book and blog. This came out of a book that a colleague and I wrote about the GIS Guide to Public Domain Data. And every week we have short essays about where to find data, how do I know if it's any good, so assessing its quality, and societal issues, copyright, location, privacy, etc. One of the ones that I recently wrote about it came up during a GIS conference that I attended in June. One of the people at the conference went to a local minor league baseball game. This was in Louisville, Kentucky. Okay. And reported back to me the next day, hey, Joseph, there was someone giving a bobblehead prize and they wanted to scan your driver's license for registering for the prize, to receive the prize. And I said, interesting. Did they have some sort of disclaimer on we're not going to sell this information, but how can you make sure that that's going to be protected? The most disturbing thing was not to me that they were requiring that. The most disturbing thing to me was that there was a long line of people waiting to do it, willing to have their licenses scanned. So in this essay, I talk about, okay, every time I fly, like when I flew to Idaho in May, I have to have my license scanned by TSA, right? That is an agreement. If I want to travel for work or for fun, I have to let those people scan my license. But to me, there's no prize, and I'm not coming down on the people in the line, okay? But there's no prize in my way of thinking that would let me voluntarily get all that personal information on my driver's license scanned by who knows what and who knows how secure their data is going to be. I can't think of a prize that would be good enough for me to submit to doing that. So that's just one of the essays in this spatial reserves data blog that I hope is helpful going forward. Okay. So when should you share your map data? Who should you share it with? These are questions that we grapple with all the time in the workplace, right? I work with tribal governments. A lot of that data they're not going to share for good reason. Tribal sacred sites, etc. I'm also a member of the caving community, right? There's a National Cave Protection Act. You cannot put locations, lat longs of caves on your data set, in your data set. And lots of other reasons we could talk about. National security issues and many, many reasons why you shouldn't share data, many reasons why you should. But again, that's part of the discussion. I also like this. I ask you to think about this think method. And this is on top of my favorite landscape in Western Colorado. Anyway, the point is your map true? Is it inspiring, helpful, inspiring, necessary, and kind? Think. We don't often talk about, is your map kind? What do we mean by that? Interesting. We could have a whole discussion on that. But that's another technique that I would just like you to kind of wrap your mind around. I mentioned this showing bad maps, but also part of that discussion is we've got these data feeds at our fingertips. Are we being critical of that data as well? Are there errors in there? I know it gets hot in Texas, but this is really hot, really windy, and it's like Noah's flood. Look at the precipitation rate. That's some serious wind, flood, and heat and humidity. The only thing that's normal is the pressure. The point is, this was online for a year from a standard weather feed in Cleburne, Texas, just down the road from one of my favorite place names, which is Waxahachie, Texas. I love that. What's my favorite place name in Idaho? I'll have to think about that. Mountain Home, since it's such a geographic name, kind of comes, close to the heart. I love that name. Anyway, the point is, if I was making an interpolated surface of that data, I'd have a big mountain with like 4 variables at Cleburne. So are you being critical of the data feeds? They could be an error. And indeed, this was online for a whole year. And I finally took a screenshot of it because I thought someone's going to fix this. And sure enough, it's fixed now. But something to keep in mind. The 4 C's of data quality, I think, are helpful to frame in this discussion as well. Can we trace the data? Oftentimes, I'll see something in ArcGIS Online that looks good, and you go to the profile of the person creating it, and there's that default head and shoulders. No information at all about the person creating it. So if you're sharing things, or if you encourage your colleagues to share things, are they including at least a little bit about, thanks, Evan, about where they're from, what makes them tick, what kind of organization? They don't have to write their master's thesis in there, but something that gives you a little bit more information about, can I trust that data? Also, imagery. I have discussions in that Spatial Reserves blog about being critical of imagery data. Go to Google Maps and pan over to China sometime. The vectors are offset from the satellite imagery. Neither one of them is correct. They're both offset. Also, some imagery can have procedures done on it for a good reason. The vehicles have been removed because the state DOT wants the moving vehicles to be. So they're not as if you were peering over the aircraft or the drone or the satellite, right? They're not exactly what's on the ground, especially nowadays when it's increasingly easy to manipulate images. And again, not necessarily for nefarious reasons, but there are a few examples that I have in that Spatial Reserves blog where data has been faked. It's been placed on different parts of the globe, and it's not really that area of Tacoma. It's actually from a different part of the world. Also in these tools, it's exciting because you can make these 3D scenes, right? And we've got some ArcGIS, examples here. It's cool that I can go to the weather and a tab in 3D scene or in ArcGIS Globe or in other tools, and I can make it snow. Now, it did snow in Redlands at our mother ship. They could use some precipitation right now because some of my colleagues have been evacuated. But anyway, you can make it snow. It snowed in February 2023. Maybe some of you remember people taking images. Hey, it's snowing in Redlands, California, and San Bernardino. It didn't stick, but you can make it accumulate at one of our new buildings on the Esri mothership campus. So it's never accumulated like that. But in my tool, I can do that. It's interesting to do, but is it, is it encouraging people to think, oh, that's really what it looks like there? Interesting. I was working on a Lyme disease study in Rhode Island. And I noticed when I was updating my data by town, so, New England's got some interesting geography. So towns kind of between municipalities and counties. So in these towns in Rhode Island, I noticed that all the Lyme disease rates from the 1990s to the 2000s went down. And you and I, being critical of data, that kind of seems too good to be true. And indeed, calling the state health department, they said, Joseph, we had less funding in the 2000s, and it looks like the rates went down. It was because we were underreporting. That kind of thing oftentimes does not make its way into metadata. Sometimes it takes an old-fashioned phone call or email to the data provider to dig deeper. Now, most of my examples are in education. People's lives and property are not depending on Joseph's web maps, but many of you have actually more important jobs than me, and people are depending. So even more important that you contact oftentimes the data providers and even on your own data. This is a interesting short example, but collecting data, rest assured, I was not going through people's backyards. This first, zinger that I have on my eventually, oh, okay, Joseph's walking around the reservoir collecting points. But that first set of lines is clearly not where I actually walked. There are some ethical case studies from my colleague, David DiBiase. He used to be on our education team. He's now at Penn State. Well, he was at Penn State then when he was at Esri. Now I think he missed his students, and so he's now back at Penn State. But anyway, some of those things that David's got in there are really, really good for real conversations. Researchers track mobile phone users' movements to derive predictive models of human mobility. A government agency's need to recoup user fees conflicts with the public records law and others that he's got in these real world scenarios. Another one that's a real world scenario set is from my own colleague here in Colorado, Dr. Dara Seidel. And she's got a series of location privacy interviews, including one with Repo Man. So Repo Man has cameras on the front of his car. He works for a company that collects license plate data to figure out if any of these vehicles were stolen. Where do they have Repo Man go? Is that ethical? Does he care about this on a deep level? And in the interviews, he's talking about, I'm just the driver. I'm just providing the data for this organization. And that's an interesting one. Also, I think another effective technique is to use some of those gigapan images or gigapixel images. Most of those, as you probably know, are extremely engaging. Zooming in, for example, off of a tower in China or off of the Big Ben in London and or the London Eye, I think is where it actually was filmed from, but or taken the image from. But the point is, you can see inside people's dashboards in their cars. You can see inside open windows. The faces are not blurred, etc. So what are the implications there? Where you can have these images that are extremely high resolution. Also, you're making a story map. This is another way of injecting thoughtful discussion in your own workshops that you're teaching, courses you're teaching, or just in discussion with colleagues. You're making a story map. Can you use a photo from Bob's Photos Inc. in your story map? Just because it's online doesn't mean you have necessarily the authority, the privilege, the capability to use it. Interesting. No, you need to talk to Bob and ask permission from Bob, or use your own images or public domain images from the USGS, most US federal agencies, or Creative Commons to look carefully at the licensing before you actually use it in your story map, because you don't want to call from Bob someday. Hey, I noticed you're using my image in your story map. I don't recall giving you permission to do so. And there is a very compelling and useful graphic that talks about can you use that image in your own, even if it's you're not making a profit from it, but it's something you produced in your organization and you're sharing it. And then another interesting discussion to build on that is should I use that picture? There are some articles written of famous examples around the world where photograph, geotagged, hey, there's this cool place in Botswana. And then suddenly, over the course of the next few months, thousands of people descend on that location because you've indicated the latitude and longitude, you put it in a map, or you've got a EXIF file and you've got the lat long in there. And now many people know about that wonderful place and it's being overloved with some ecological harm to that place. So that's another interesting discussion to have with folks. Another way is take a look at many of you are GISPs and professional certification from the GIS Certification Institute. Look at the code of ethics. That's required reading and checking the box if you become a GISP nowadays. I actually think that that's very thoughtfully done. That's a very good document. And when does the obligation to society outweigh the obligation to my employer, my funder, or colleagues? Ooh, that's a difficult one, right? We could have a whole discussion about that. One of my colleagues here at ESRI, just to share a personal story, I've got two personal stories that I promised to be really short. Not long after she started working at ESRI, received a call from an organization saying, we want to show that there are a higher percentage of traffic accidents involving pedestrians and motorcycles in the northeast part of the USA than anywhere else. And so my colleague worked with the data, came back to the organization. The data doesn't show that. Sorry. Well, can you do like normalization? More work from my colleague? No, sorry, the data doesn't show that. And so they went away disappointed. But I'm glad, I'm pleased that my colleague stood up and said, sorry, you can't invent a pattern that doesn't exist. And, on a side note on that, oftentimes students and even colleagues in GIS say, my results show that there's no relationship between these variables. That's still insightful, right? Showing there's no relationship is still valid. It's still, you found no relationship. It's not like you're oftentimes people talk about, if I don't find a relationship, then my whole analysis is invalid. No. Yeah, exactly, Keith. Anyway, the point of the second story I'm going to share is when I was working with our ESRI Press people on the Tribal GIS book. It's in its second edition now. And they're wonderful editors over there. And they're doing their job when they said, hey, Joseph, these stories in this Tribal GIS book are in different voices. They're in different tones. Some are high tech, some are low tech. We're going to do our usual edit on this. And it was, nope, I put my stake in the ground. I did not want this book to be the Joseph Tribal GIS story. It's critically important in the indigenous community and in other communities, but in particular in the indigenous community, that those voices are heard. There are plenty of other books about uses of GIS. I wanted their voices to be heard, even though they're very different in tone. So I said, you cannot do a heavy edit on this for all those reasons. And also, I'm going to lose credibility with all the people that I've been working with over the last year saying your voice is going to shine through in this book. So it was not long after I actually started working at ESRI, and I thought to myself, again, gosh, am I going to be fired for this? I mean, but I'm really glad I stood up for what I believed was right. So you think about the choices that you've had to make in the past in your own workplace. I think those are powerful stories to share with people, even though at the time they were difficult to go through. Also, good metadata strategies to model those are important still in 2024. We still need to be talking about this. Truth in labeling and fitness for use. Is that data fit for your use? Does the data provider, which could be you, right? Because you may be the data provider as well as the data consumer these days. And oftentimes I get this from students and even elsewhere. Is my map right? But most often from students. It's not their fault. I'm not coming down on them. They have been, and Keith, you and I and others that are in education can get into a discussion at some point about if the world of education revolved around us, it would be a bit different. Okay. Not that we have all the answers, but this whole over reliance on standardized tests. And we really want students to come up with the right answer for these tests. Memorize big blocks of content, regurgitate it for the test. And we've all had that experience, even in our university experience, right, folks? So it's no surprise that they come to us in GIS and say, is my map right? I come back with a couple of things. I'm just going to highlight two of these. Well, Good question, but let's think about, does it meet your understand? Does it help your understanding in the issue that you're grappling with, whether it's population change or natural hazards or something else? If it helps you and helps people that you're sharing it with, then it meets your needs. Okay. And also, can you justify the choices that you've made, the data sources, the scale, the representation of that data in your map? Those are, I think, better questions than is it right? Now, there are some, as promised, some ethical initiatives that might help you and others that you share this with. I've got a paper that I worked on with AAG and others about locational interest information in the public interest. That's out for public review. It's been out for a couple years. That might be of interest to you. I mentioned Michael Goodchild. He was the one that organized this paper. So it was business, industry, academics, some lawyers were there, and nonprofits, government agencies, all grappling with this issue and coming up with this paper that we want people to dig into. There's also this map maker's mantra from some colleagues of mine here, Aileen Buckley, who probably many of you know, and others on the cartography team. Be honest and accurate, transparent and accountable, minimize harm, seek to provide value, be humble and courageous. That's my favorite one. Be humble and courageous. We don't often talk about us in the GIS world being courageous, but maybe we should. We are breaking down barriers in many ways. I just love that. So take a look at that. Also, reflections from the Equitable Data Working Group on data equity, and also the International Science Council Co-Data Working Group. Some good stuff has come out of both of those organizations, as well as the African Association of Universities, Nottingham, and the Ethical Data Initiative, Campaign for Data Ethics in Education from last year. Also, I wanted to mention that I think it's an encouraging sign that ethics are appearing more frequently in these mainstream texts. For example, conservation social science, which I looked at a couple months back. Understanding People and Conserving Biodiversity is the subtitle. I don't know if we would have had a book like that 10 years ago, where you would have biodiversity texts and you had social sciences texts, and now you've got a touch point where we're talking with each other. And indeed, um, even in the handbook of geospatial technologies that I and others had chapters in, there's lots of social constructivism, ethics, and other relevant topics. Also, there is a ESRI Social Science Initiative. And our chief scientist, Dr. Don Wright, who many of you know, actually sponsored this initiative. So a bunch of us actually get together monthly talking about what tools is the academic and other communities asking us to incorporate. You know, for years, GIS, and I think rightly so, was criticized for being too positivistic, only focusing on quantitative data and analysis. What about behaviors and other things that people want to map and understand nowadays? How do we build tools that enable them to do that? And I think it's notable that Dr. Wright, who was an oceanographer, physical geographer, sponsored this, recognizing that we can't just focus on the physical aspects of our world and quantitative measures. People really want to dig into this, and they're demanding tools that allow them to do that. So that's another thing that I wanted to mention. And not that it's the end all be all, but I do have an essay in the American Geographical Society's Ethical Geo column that other people have also authored things in that you might want to take a look at. AGS has been around since, I think, 1851, so they have some valid things to say. I talked about the Spatial Reserves data blog, where we talk every 2 weeks or so about how to find data, how to know if it's any good, and societal issues. There's also the UCGIS body of knowledge that many instructors use and many students and others use as learning tools. It's an ebook. It's a dynamic, multiple authors, peer-reviewed ebook. It's the UCGIS body of knowledge. And I've got a chapter in there on location privacy that digs a little deeper into this. Maybe you can identify where this fence was that I took a picture of. That doesn't look like it could be near the Bruneau Dunes, but it isn't, especially that fence being what it is. It's actually in the UAE. So I was teaching GIS in the UAE, and I thought, you know, that's an interesting picture. There's a big break in the fence to the right of that gate that I crawled through to get to a certain longitude, latitude position, which is why I was out there. The point is, there are some resources that you can dig into. So this story map, once again, I hope is useful as a starting point, a springboard for discussions. I've got loads of links in there that you saw that, it's a work in progress. The final chapter in all of this is not being written. In fact, we've only just begun. Oh, that's an old Carpenter song, which is a great song. But the point is, do you folks have any questions, comments,